Hello and welcome to GryphonArt, and as you can probably see, this week I'm in Easter mode. Now this has been prompted because I've noticed that increasingly we're getting variations on these original Cadbury's cream egg, and we're getting a lot of these little eggs in the supermarkets these days which are just sold loosely, and as a consequence it's not very easy to give them as a token gift at Easter, and I wanted to get around this. Having created the design and bearing in mind that we're still a little way from Easter, I thought that I would share it with you. So before we get started, I am just going to quickly show you the design so that you can make sure that it is actually something that is of interest to you. So it's basically the same front and back. Ribbon out, and it's held, the egg itself is held in place by this brace, and because it's this part that makes the design appropriate for different size eggs. So it's just on a base. That's for the larger egg. We've got a similar style for the smaller Galaxy egg, which is probably similar in size to the Cadbury's cream egg. And then we have one of my favourite little chocolate eggs, actually, the Lindt chocolate egg. Now on that note, actually, I just thought you might be interested to know that if you have a bit of a craving ahead of Easter and you eat the egg, which is exactly what I did, you can go out to the shop and get another one and put it back. So as long as you get your base in, and then just keep the ribbons out of the way, you can fit another egg in there. So all is not lost if you decide to eat an egg in advance in a moment of craving. Right, so we may as well get started, and the first thing I'm going to do is work on that band that I showed you, simply because it needs a bit of gluing, and it's as well to get it sorted so it can dry out. Now I have used a die cutter to create these decorative holes along the centre of the band, but you don't need to do that if you don't wish. The other thing is that if you're interested in what die cutters I'm using, then I will provide a list in the description area for this video, and I'll also take some photographic stills to include at the end of the video so that you've got a pictorial reference for those. Right, so this is a 1/2 inch wide strip taken off the portrait side of a piece of A4 paper, or card I should say. Now we need to make a number of score lines in this piece of card. We're going to start at 4 3/4 inches. It's a little bit more difficult because of those perforations, but it's fine. Then we want 5 1/8. Then we want 5 5/8, 6 3/8, 6 7/8, almost there, and 7 1/4 inches. So I can now just very quickly fold along each of those marker lines. They don't really need too much reinforcing, unlike perhaps the sides of the box would. So I'm just going to put those in place. And then we can just line up the edges a bit, and then we'll be able to get our glue sorted. Okay, so now you can see those last two, or the first and last score lines, we can bring them together because the length of the card is not even, it's just the way that the template is worked out. But you want to glue together this section here in order to create this little triangular shape at the top, but you're only gluing that little section and keeping these pieces free. So just very quickly do that with a little bit of PVA, just to illustrate what I mean. So it's just that last little section there. I'm just going to bring these together, line them up. You don't need to worry if there's some glue that comes through there, because actually we'll be covering it with ribbon, so it's not going to show. The PVA does take a little while to go off actually, so but as long as it's set up, once you're sure that it's going to hold, you can put it to one side and come back to it when you're ready to use it. So we can now move on to the base of our box and get our score lines in ready for that. And to do that, you'll need a piece of card that is 7¼ inches by 4½ inches, and we're going to start with that on the Martha Stewart scoreboard at so that it's in portrait mode. So the score lines that we need for that, we need to start out at 5/8 of an inch, and we're scoring on the wrong side of the card. Then we need to be at 1¼ inches. And then we're at 3¼ inches, so the centre of our box is actually around 2 inches square. And finally we're at 3 7/8 of an inch. Now, because this is symmetrical, it doesn't really matter whether you turn this clockwise or anti-clockwise. You just now need to make sure that it's in landscape mode, and we can then proceed to score at 2 inches, two and 5/8 of an inch, 4 and 5/8 of an inch, and 5¼ inches. Now that's all of the scoring that we need to do for this particular project. So I am going to get rid of my Martha Stewart scoreboard, but before we start to crease and fold along those lines, we need to create a hole in the center here for our egg to base to rest in. So I'm going to do that with my die cutter, and then I'll come back to you thereafter. Right, so that's that now done, and I've just for your information, I've just used a little 7/8 of an inch round die cutter for that. So we can now get on and put all our fold lines in place and crease them. And you know, as I've said before in my other videos, what we're actually doing is lining up our score lines and fold lines rather than the edges of our card, unless you know that you've cut your card absolutely squarely, and then you're probably safe using the edges. But certainly a lot of cardstock that you buy isn't necessarily square when you get it. So I'll just very quickly do that. There we go. That's good. So that's all of those in place. So the next thing that we need to do is take away some of the excess card. So I tend to do this a bit at a time. I know that we need to get rid of this whole corner here. So so we'll get rid of that first. But I also know that this little square piece is also not needed, so also get rid of that. Not quite. There we go. Better. And then in order for us to build our box, we need to cut into this to create a flap, and it doesn't really matter whether you cut this way or this way, but just keep it consistent. So I'm going to cut up to that point there. So I need to do that with all the 4 corners. So to save time, I'll do that off camera and come back to you when I've finished. So that's all the excess card now removed, which means that we're left with the template as it needs to be. You can see that I've cut into all of these little corner pieces, so that's going to allow me to fold the box and assemble it. Now you'll also notice that I've put on all my double-sided tape just to save time on camera once again. So if you just want to make a note, if you're using double-sided tape, for the main part you're sticking your adhesion on the right side of your box. So all of these, I tend to use an overlapping technique, so I've put one single piece of tape on the inside of that flap, which would be the last flap to go down, and that will cover this area here, because I'm not sure where that's going to be positioned, and it just means that I get adhesion very close to the edge. So we can now go ahead and assemble the box. So I'm going to be using some PVA glue as well as the tape, which if you have been watching my videos you'll know is quite customary for me. And I'm going to start with these little side flaps, and I'm working with them 2 at a time. It's just a good habit for me to get into, because whilst you've got access to the first 2 on an individual basis, the second 2 I'll illustrate a bit later, but it's not easy to get access to the last one if you haven't already put glue onto it. So I like to do this so that I've got it on a stable platform. So I put it right on the ground and then raise this side edge up to form a nice right angle. There you go. And I don't worry too much, I probably should, but I don't worry too much about any excess glue, because the side of this plinth will be covered up later. Just give that PVA a little chance to go off. This is where using a combination of PVA and double-sided tape helps, because the double-sided tape grabs immediately and will hold everything in place, but you have to wait for the PVA a bit longer. So I pop that down again so that I can more or less feel that I'm getting a nice right angle on that, and just then wait for that glue to go off. So I'm just going to demonstrate, I'll do it off camera, the gluing, but I just want to demonstrate that, because that just needs time to go off, that if you put glue on just one of these and stuck that in, it's not very easy for you to get access to this last one, so that's why it's best to do it as a pair. And I'm just going to do that off camera because that glue is taking a while just to settle in. I'll come back to you in a minute. So I've given that glue plenty of time to go off, and so now that we're using double-sided tape as well, we should be able to move on fairly quickly. So the next thing we need to do is just sort these flaps out. So I'm just going to put some PVA on there just to secure those edges a bit. You may decide that you don't want to use this combination. You know, if you've been doing crafts for a long time, you've probably become familiar with certain brands of glue or certain different forms of adhesion, and that's absolutely fine. I just use what I've become happy with myself, so I haven't got a problem if you do the same. So I'm just going to remove the backing from that double-sided tape. And then it's this other flap with the tape on the back that goes down against that, as you've probably gathered. I'm just going to set that down because I think you can still see it. Just gives me a more stable base to work from. And once that's down, I can flip it upside down and just apply pressure from the inside. So I know that's not really going to move anywhere. And now I can do the same thing here. I just tend to remove this tape, backing tape first, because otherwise I have a tendency to forget about it. And bearing in mind that's going to make sure we've got adhesion here, I'll only need to apply the PVA in these little gaps. So that's what I'll do, just very quickly on the ends there as well. I do think that the PVA has much more strength than this particular make of double-sided tape. You can get really high tack double-sided tape, which this isn't, and if you're using that, you may feel that that's more than sufficient. I tend to use a slightly lower tack tape so that I've got some margin for error. It doesn't grab permanently the first time. So that's just a repeat with that last flap, and again we can use some pressure on the inside to make sure that that goes nicely in place. So that's our plinth finished. So at this point we can turn our attention to our egg, which in this case is going to be the Cadbury's cream egg, and also our brace, because these need to be fitted together. Now I do, off camera I would work on the edge of the table so that I can see what I'm doing, but I'm just using this little pot to give some height, and hopefully I'll be able to do enough on camera so that you can see what's going on. So all you're trying to do is to, in the first instance, position your egg so that it's standing up straight on all sides. So it's nicely set in that base. That's the first thing you need to make sure. Then what you want to be doing is making sure that that's centered as much as possible over the edges of the egg and coming down the side so that you've got this nice central arrangement. You do need it to be reasonably tight, but if you want to be able to eat the eggs and replace them at a later date, then it's that compromise between it being too tight and, you know, flexible enough for you to do something with. So once you've decided that you've got everything centered, you can then turn one of these edges in to create the fold. In fact, you could do it on both sides if you wanted, but what I tend to do is just do the one, and then I'll return to my scoreboard and score that line in place, which I'll do off camera in this instance, and then make sure that this other line is at exactly the same point, because that's the only way of knowing that you've actually centralized this top section. So I'm going to sort the rest of that out on camera so that it's ready for fitting, and then I'll come back to you. Well, I just thought that this might illustrate a little better for you what I mean. It's just that when you've got these, I've folded up those ends just to show, so that I can demonstrate to you that when they're folded and this section is straight, they're both the same length. That's what you're aiming for, and that's going to prevent any lopsided aspect to your presentation. So I hope that helps. So we're at that stage. The other thing to bear in mind is when you fit, I'm going to do another dry fit, because you might find that with the folds, this is not exactly 2 inches square by the time you've finished. So you do just want to make sure that if you're fitting it to the box this way, then that's where you want to glue it. Otherwise you might find it's either too tight or too loose. So if I fit that in a dry run and make sure that it is on those bends nicely and attached at the edge, I can then, I hope you can see that although that is going to stay in place, that egg, notice I'm using my hand in case it doesn't, I can actually tilt it one way and remove it from the base. So that's about the sort of fit that you're looking for. So all I need to do now, take that off, I can start by just gauging where the glue can come up to. I know that it's this side, so I'll leave that stood up. I'll apply some glue along here. And then, unfortunately, we're back to that drying time again, but if you can just bear with me, that would be great. I'll try and use a bit less. There we go. So all I'm going to do now, I know it was this side where I fitted it, so I'm going to get that fold on that edge, and I'm just going to use my eye in this case to get an idea of where I need to place that. And once I'm happy, I can put this across the back section on the base and fit that in place. And I can use a little bit of tissue as well to mop up any excess glue. And again, I'm not too worried at this stage if there's glue oozing out of these little holes, because that will get covered up. So I then just need to do the same thing with this side, and I'll line it up and glue it so that it lines up at the base here. And I'll do that off camera, and then I'll come back to you at that point. So that's that finished, and the glue has had time to go off. So you can see it's all lined up. I'm happy with that. I've done a dry run, I know everything fits. So I can now get on and embellish this plinth section. Now I'm going to be using a Spellbinders die cut, and as I say, I will leave details for you in the description area for these die cuts as a minimum. And because I want to have the front and back of my display looking at presentation level, I don't want the join to be anywhere near the front. So I know that each of these is 1 inch wide, and I know that my plinth is approximately 2 inches wide. So I'm just going to straddle these and sort of find a point at which I can bend them around the corner and not be too far out on this edge here. So that's about there. And I'm just going to work with that front section to start with. So that's the area that I want to apply some glue. And once again, I'm using my PVA glue. So I'm just going to put some, I normally work in the larger areas first, and then use it as a basis to dab the glue everywhere else. So as I say, it's just across that 2 inch section that will cover the front of my plinth. And I'm not worried if glue goes higher than the adhesion is required, because it will raise up above the edge of this plinth. Because actually I'd rather that as much of this embellishment was stuck to the side of the plinth as possible, and any that is at the top here will dry off and actually strengthen the card anyway. So, and it dries clear, PVA glue dries nice and clear, so that's not a problem. So there we go, that's applied my glue to that, and it's just a question now of putting that onto my plinth. So sometimes easier to work from a sturdy base. So just applying some pressure to that and absorbing any glue that may have oozed. and I can just let that go off. Now I do work with one edge at a time, so I'll be working my way around, and I'll glue those down off camera, and I'll just come back to you at the point at which I need to deal with this join, so that you know what you're doing there. So I've actually joined that embellishment along 3 sides, and you can see that I've got that almost just about touches that corner there. I hope you can see that. But actually, if I trim this back on that, along that edge, there will still be a line of purple on that corner, which I want to avoid. It's going to be more obvious than if I've got these gold lines in place, or ginger as they actually are called. So what I'm going to do is to trim back that. I don't need much of an overlap, so I'll just probably maybe just over 1/8 of an inch, but I'll trim that back by. If in doubt, you can always trim back a bit more later. So, and I'll probably just take that little top bit out as well, because that won't be needed. Dry runs, I always like dry runs. They just save you making a real mistake. And although those don't line up exactly, it'll be better actually once I've glued them. It's preferable, I think, to having a strip of purple showing in that corner. So I'm just going to go ahead now and glue that in the same way that I've done the dry run, and then I'll come back to you and we can move on to the ribbon. So that's now finished, and the glue's had a bit of time to go off as well, which is a good thing. And if I just show you that, it's not an exact overlap. It's because although the box is approximately 2 inches square, this is going around that circumference, so you know it becomes ever increasingly bigger. So but it's not bad. It produces a reasonable join, which is probably better than seeing a strip of purple there. It's less obvious. It's entirely up to you, of course. You know, you'll find your own way and what you think looks aesthetically pleasing. So the next thing we're going to do is sort out the ribbon, and that will finish this little base section. Now, again, referring to the fact that our base is 2 inches square, so we're dealing with 8 inches. I've just cut off a length of ribbon that's 9 inches long, and I've put some double-sided tape along the back of it just to save time off camera. And I use double-sided tape really in this instance because I've yet to find a glue that doesn't get absorbed into the fabric if you use a little bit too much of it, creating sort of hard patches or dark patches. So I stick to the double-sided tape, and I do find that even this lower tack tape is strong enough. So I found that corner again because I want to overlap at that point as well, so I'm keeping my joins all in the same place. So I'm just going to take the backing tape off this if I can. I always find it tricky on ribbon, more tricky than at other times actually. So I'm just going to start. I'll position it a little way up because I'd like to see the ginger above and below. And so I've just started on that corner, and I can stretch it across here and get an eye for how it's lining up before I actually push that corner home, and then I can apply pressure so that it sticks in place along that edge, and just work my way round doing the same thing. And we're going to line up this one over that starting point, and then neatly trim off any excess. So there we go. So that's the plinth part finished with. Now the second area that we also require some ribbon is just around this section here, and I know that this is 1/2 inch wide, and this will, I want the ribbon to wrap round effectively 3 times. So erring as usual on the side of caution, as I do, I've just cut a piece of ribbon that's 2 inches, don't think you can see that, 2 inches in length, and again I've put the double-sided tape on the back. So I'm not going to start from the very edge of this. I'll show you, actually, easier to visualize, isn't it? So where's the front? This is the front of my box, so it doesn't really matter where the join is. I think if I think I need to start this side. It doesn't really matter, as I say, and I'm not going to go the full amount because I do want to have excess to cut off. That way I know that at least the end is at the end and not positioned in the middle. So again, it's just a question of wrapping it round, allowing it to stick, and then it's a bit of, don't like that. What's that? I'm just going to trim that off. It's a bit of loose thread there. There we go. Don't want that on my box. And just wrap it round, and then again, you see there's quite a bit of excess there, so you may not have needed quite that length of ribbon, but I err on the side of caution. So I'm just going to trim that bit off, and that's the collar sorted. So the next thing that I want to do is to place this little embellishment on here, but I just want to talk to you about that before I move any further. I've used that same circular die cut that I used to cut the hole for the egg to sit in. So it's a 7/8 of an inch die cut, so that forms the back of that. And then I used this lovely vintage penny farthing die cut, which is, I think, beautiful, and all I've done is I've cut that back wheel off, and then I've applied that to that circle in order to create this effect. So I hope you can see that okay. So that's basically how that's been formed. Now you may have a cog or something that's of an appropriate size, a different die cut, but that was how I got around, creating something for this. Now, one thing I will say is that this is quite flimsy, you'll see that it's actually bigger, that little wheel is actually bigger than the backing disc. And if the wheel is cut out of thinner card, this card is actually quite thin, and you're worried about it, that it's going to get damaged, just stick together with PVA glue. It'll strengthen it up no end, and you'll be good to go. So that's just a hint. So I'm just going to go ahead and glue this one to here, so that we've got two the same to start with. I'm going to put a bit of glue on my hand to do that. I just find it easier this way sometimes, so I haven't got something else to try and hold on to. Actually, spread that around a bit. Make sure the front of this rather than the back, although it doesn't really matter. It's just placed on the back there, and then I can leave that to go off. Right, now this needs to get stuck to this here, and there isn't an awful lot of room for glue here. So just as a tip, I've got some 1/2 inch width of card, just some scrap card, cut it to a 1/2 inch width and curled it all up, because this is 1/2 inch width. And I'm going to, actually that might be a bit much, start with a smaller piece. Maybe curl it a bit more tightly. I'm just tucking that in there like that, because that gives us an increased area for glue, and that's going to help us quite a lot. It just means that this embellishment is not so precariously placed. So the first thing I'm going to do is put quite a bit of glue on here. Again, it's PVA, so we do know that's going to take a long time to dry, but I'm going to work with one side at a time, and I probably will only show you one side, because once you've seen one side, you know what you're up to for the next. So I'm just using the top of the Yoo-hoo actually to provide some support for that, and then it's just a question of positioning that, and it actually wants to be positioned where this, as far down as the bottom of the ribbon. So just set that up again, and once that's in place, just check this side that I'm happy. Yeah, once you're happy that it's positioned where you want it to be, just leave it alone. Not like me, I have a tendency to fiddle endlessly, but actually in reality it's best just left for the glue to go off, so that it's very secure before you start fiddling with it again. So I'm going to do exactly that, just leave that for that glue to come up, to set a bit, and then I'll come back to you as soon as that's happened. Now that hasn't gone off totally, still a bit white as you can see, but it's secure enough that I'm happy to move on. And we have got to use more PVA unfortunately, but never mind, we'll take that as it comes. So the next thing I want to do is to put this additional little embellishment in the center here. Now I've chosen to use cold porcelain flowers, and if you have cold porcelain and you want to make these, then there is a tutorial that I've done on how to make them, and I'll include a link for you in the description area, so you can have a look at that if you want to. Now alternatively, you could use buttons or some other embellishment, or even use it plain if you leave it plain if you preferred. So cold porcelain has a high element of PVA glue in it anyway, so using it to stick the flowers is going to work well. I normally put a reasonable amount in and sort of work out which way I want the flower to go around, and just drop it into place. I can then nudge it a little bit with a bone folder or some similar tool. And again, it's a case of not fiddling too much. Once that glue goes off, it'll hold fast, so it is appropriate just to leave it to do its thing. Now ordinarily I would not go further, but for the in the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and stick on the next embellishment that we need for this size, which is just a little ribbon that I'm sticking underneath that flower. Now I'm going to do that using some Yoo-hoo. I find that a reasonably strong glue for this kind of task, and because the back of the ribbon is quite thick, even if the glue is slightly absorbed, it's not going to impair the aesthetic appearance of the finished item in any way. The other thing is I'm using a cocktail stick today, because in a recent tutorial I squeezed the tube of Yoo-hoo and it oozed all over the place. So I'm erring on the side of caution again, deciding to use a cocktail stick to apply my glue, and then it's just a question of placing it underneath that little flower on the bottom of the wheel. positioning the tails where you want them to some extent. And then leaving that to go off. Now that's as far as we can go. I'm going to leave that to go off thoroughly, and then I'll turn it over and do exactly the same thing to the other side, and at that stage I'll come back to you. So that's it. I'm reasonably happy that that's going to be secure enough to continue and just finish off. So we've got our embellishments on both sides. So all we really need to do now is to pop our egg in and trim these ribbon tails down to a length that we desire. So we do have to be a bit careful because the foils on these are often a bit loose and you don't want to catch them on this strapping. But I find the best way is to put the egg in face down, have it on a firm base as well. Just ease that band over the top. Make sure that it's positioned where you want the writing, because a lot of these eggs have writing on them. And then we're just going to bring those ribbons where we can see them and trim them back. I quite like them reasonably short, but you know, it's personal preference. As always, what looks good to one person doesn't necessarily look good to another. So that's one side, slightly uneven actually. I'm going to trim a bit more off. Not paying attention. There we go. And I'll just do the same at the back here. Oops, I'll fetch that in a minute. And that one. Right, so let's just tip that upside down. There's one piece. Where's the other piece? Gone. Oh, there it is. Come on. Great. So we're all sorted now. So I know it doesn't look particularly pretty at the back, but it's just the way the wrapping is. But it's nice at the front, I think. I don't know what your opinion is, but there we go. And actually, it's quite interesting how with the use of different colours, you can actually get quite a different look. So there we are. That's my project for this week. I hope it's been of interest to you and maybe inspired you to do something of your own. Don't forget that there is a template available on the website at GryphonArt.co.uk, and I'll provide a direct link through to that template in the description area for this video. So thank you very much for watching today, and I hope that I see you in other weeks. Bye bye then.